Keanu Reeves stepped quietly into the lavish Aurora restaurant. His worn jeans and scuffed boots stood in stark contrast to the sparkling chandeliers and designer-clad elite around him. A haughty waiter named Marcus sized him up with open disdain, his arrogance evident in every word. But what transpired next would not only leave the entire dining room in shock, it would turn Marcus's world upside down in ways no one could foresee. Before we delve into this astonishing story, feel free to comment below about where you're watching from, and if you enjoy captivating tales like this, remember to subscribe, because tomorrow we've got another amazing story lined up just for you. Keanu Reeves entered Aurora, a Beverly Hills shrine to wealth and exclusivity. His faded jeans, scuffed boots, and worn leather jacket were a jarring contrast to the polished elegance surrounding him. The restaurant buzzed with Hollywood moguls, socialites, and tycoons, all draped in designer attire. Their conversations formed a symphony of power plays and name-dropping. Aurora wasn't merely a dining venue. It was a stage where status was on display. And Keanu, with his unpretentious demeanor, appeared like an outsider in a world that revered appearances. Marcus, one of Aurora's senior waiters, spotted him immediately. Recently promoted to shift manager, Marcus thrived on his newfound authority, viewing himself as the guardian of Aurora's esteemed hierarchy. For him, this wasn't just a restaurant. It was a battleground where he could diminish those he deemed unworthy. Marcus prided himself on his ability to read people, categorizing them by their attire, posture, and aura. To Marcus, Keanu, in his threadbare jacket and unkempt hair, was nothing more than an intruder. His lips curled into a sneer as he leaned toward a junior waiter, Daniel, who stood nearby. "Look at this," Marcus muttered, his voice low but dripping with contempt. "Another nobody who thinks he can just waltz in here." Daniel, a nervous young man still finding his footing, glanced at Keanu and shifted uneasily. "Maybe he's just here to eat," he suggested weakly. But Marcus dismissed him. "Eat," Marcus scoffed. "People like him come to gawk, not to dine. Watch how I handle this." With the confidence of a predator, Marcus adjusted his pristine uniform, smoothed his slicked-back hair, and strode toward Keanu, who was now standing near the front desk, calmly perusing the menu on his stand. There was a stillness in Keanu's posture, a quiet confidence that didn't match his appearance. But Marcus, blinded by arrogance, saw only a target. Clearing his throat loudly enough to attract the attention of nearby patrons, Marcus positioned himself in front of Keanu, arms crossed, his smile as fake as the politeness in his voice. "Good evening, sir," he began, his tone overly sweet but laced with venom. "Are you lost?" Keanu tilted his head slightly, his dark eyes meeting Marcus's with a flicker of amusement. "No," he replied, his voice steady and low. "I'm here for dinner." Marcus's eyes narrowed, his amusement replaced by irritation at Keanu's calm demeanor. "Dinner?" he repeated, dragging out the word, as if savoring the absurdity. "I see. Well, Aurora is an exclusive establishment. We cater to a very specific clientele. Are you sure this is where you want to be?" Keanu's lips curved into a small, knowing smile, but his tone remained even. "Pretty sure, unless you're suggesting I'm not welcome." The directness of the question caught Marcus off guard, but he quickly recovered, his smirk widening. "Oh, not at all," he said, his voice now openly condescending. "But let's be honest, sir, this isn't exactly the kind of place we're people in." He paused, letting his gaze rake over Keanu's worn clothes. "Quote, dot. Your kind typically dine. We have standards, you see." Keanu raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "Standards?" he echoed, his tone carrying a hint of challenge. "And those standards are based on what, exactly? The price tag on my jacket?" Marcus bristled, his facade of politeness slipping. "It's about presentation," he snapped, his voice rising just enough to draw more eyes. "This is Aurora, not some dive bar. Our guests expect a certain level of class, something you clearly don't understand." Keanu's smile didn't waver, but his eyes sharpened, a quiet intensity in his gaze. "Class," he said, his voice low but cutting. "Interesting word. I always thought class was about how you treat people, not how much you spent on your shoes. But maybe I've got it wrong." The retort hit Marcus like a slap, and for a moment his composure faltered. A few patrons nearby turned their heads, some smirking at the exchange, others whispering to their companions. Marcus, sensing the attention, doubled down, his voice now dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, I'm sure you're an expert on class," he said, his eyes glinting with malice. "But let me give you a tip, sir. If you're going to play the philosopher, do it somewhere that doesn't charge $500 for a steak. You're out of your league here." Keanu leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper, but every word was deliberate. "And you're out of line," he said, his tone calm but carrying an edge that made Marcus blink. "I asked for a table, not a lecture. Can you manage that, or should I speak to someone who can?" The challenge hung in the air, thick and electric. Marcus's face flushed with a mix of anger and humiliation, but he refused to back down. "Fine," he hissed, his voice low to avoid further attention. "If you insist on embarrassing yourself, that's your choice." He glanced at the reservation list on the tablet, not even bothering to check it properly, and tapped the screen with exaggerated flair. After a few seconds of dramatic silence, he sighed theatrically. "Well, as I suspected, you don't have a reservation." "That's okay," Keanu replied, still unruffled. "I don't mind waiting." Marcus's irritation flared into full-blown anger. This man wasn't flustered, wasn't making excuses, wasn't behaving like the intruder Marcus wanted him to be. "Waiting? Making?" Marcus repeated, his voice now openly mocking. "Sir, just so you know, we have a strict dress code. Jackets, tailored suits, elegant evening wear. You." He paused, letting his gaze linger on Keanu's scuffed boots. Quote, "You are a little underdressed for our usual guests. I'm not sure waiting will change that." A couple standing nearby, a man in a bespoke suit and a woman in a gold gown, overheard the exchange and smirked, casting sideways glances at Keanu. The woman whispered something to her partner, both chuckling under their breath. But Keanu remained unshaken. "I'm comfortable with what I'm wearing," he said, his tone even, his smile unwavering. "And I'm pretty sure your dress code doesn't trump basic hospitality. So about that table?" Marcus let out a sharp, incredulous laugh, shaking his head. "Oh, you're a real piece of work," he said, his voice now loud enough to turn more heads. "Okay then, if you insist on making a fool of yourself, be my guest." Turning on his heel, Marcus led Keanu toward the worst table in the house, a dimly lit corner next to the kitchen doors where the clatter of plates echoed relentlessly. This was where they seated guests they didn't want seen, guests they hoped would leave quickly. Pulling out the chair with an exaggerated flourish, Marcus dropped the menu onto the table with a loud thud. "Here you go," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "A nice private table, perfect for someone like you. Enjoy your dinner, if you can afford it." Keanu glanced around, then back at Marcus, his smile never fading. "Thank you," he said, his tone maddeningly calm. "I'm sure this will be memorable." Marcus smirked, already turning away. "Let's see how long you last," he muttered under his breath, loud enough for Daniel to hear as he walked back to the front. Marcus leaned toward the junior waiter and whispered, "He'll bolt as soon as he sees the prices. Mark my words." But what Marcus didn't realize was that the night was far from over, and the man he had just dismissed was about to change everything. Keanu Reeves sat calmly at the cramped, dimly lit table near Aurora's kitchen doors, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable. The faint smell of dishwater drifted through the air, and every few minutes, waiters rushed past, their trays clattering with plates and silverware. It was the kind of table reserved for guests the staff wanted gone, too close to the chaos of the kitchen, too far from the elegance of the main dining room. But Keanu didn't seem to mind. He picked up the menu, scanning the fine print with a focus that suggested he was oblivious to the indignity of his seating, or perhaps that he simply crossed the room. Marcus watched him with a mix of amusement and disdain, waiting for the moment he would realize his mistake and slink away. In Marcus's experience, men like this, those who dared to step into Aurora in worn-out clothes thinking they could belong, never lasted long. Marcus smirked and leaned toward Daniel, the junior waiter who was wiping down a nearby table. "He's just stalling," Marcus whispered, his voice dripping with mockery. "Give it 5 minutes tops, he'll see the prices and bolt." But 5 minutes passed, then 10, and Keanu remained seated, unfazed. Marcus's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Determined to regain control, Marcus decided to escalate his efforts. He grabbed a pitcher of ice water from a side station and strode toward Keanu's table. His movements deliberate, his intent clear. As he approached, he accidentally tilted the pitcher, sending a cascade of frigid water splashing onto Keanu's lap. The liquid soaked through his jeans, pooling on the floor, and a few nearby patrons gasped, their heads turning to watch the scene unfold. "Oops," Marcus said, his voice dripping with false contrition. "My apologies, sir. These things happen when we're busy serving our real guests." He set the pitcher down on the table with a loud clink, his eyes glinting with malice. "Maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere drier." Keanu looked down at his soaked clothes, then up at Marcus, his expression still maddeningly calm. He picked up a napkin, dabbing at the water with deliberate slowness, and said, "No harm done. Accidents happen, though I'm starting to think this one wasn't so accidental." Marcus's face flushed with anger, but he forced a tight smile. "Oh, I assure you, sir, it was," he said, his tone now openly hostile. "But let's be honest, you don't belong here. Why don't you do us all a favor and leave before you embarrass yourself further?" The exchange drew more attention at a nearby table. Victor and Elena, the wealthy couple who had arrived earlier, exchanged glances. Victor, a man accustomed to getting his way, leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips. "The waiter has a point," he muttered to Elena. "This place isn't for riffraff. If you can't dress the part, you shouldn't play the game." Elena, however, frowned, her sapphire gown shimmering as she shifted uncomfortably. "He's been nothing but polite," she whispered back. "The waiter's the one making a scene." At another table, Charles, an older businessman with silver hair and a navy suit, observed the situation with quiet interest. He took a slow sip of his wine, his sharp eyes missing nothing. Unlike Victor, Charles's expression was one of disapproval, though he said nothing for now. Meanwhile, he met Marcus's glare with a steady gaze of his own. "Embarrass myself?" he echoed, his voice low but carrying a quiet authority. "I'm just trying to have dinner. You're the one turning this into a spectacle. Maybe you should focus on doing your job instead of playing gatekeeper." Marcus's smile vanished, replaced by a snarl. "My job," he hissed, leaning in closer, "is to protect this restaurant's reputation, and letting someone like you sit here, soaking wet and dressed like a hobo, is bad for business. So I'll ask you one more time. Leave, or I'll have security escort you out." The threat hung in the air, thick and heavy, and the dining room fell silent, every eye now on the confrontation. Keanu leaned back in his chair, his hands resting lightly on the table, his demeanor still unshaken. "Security, huh?" he said, his tone almost amused. "That's a bold move. But before you make that call, let me ask you something. What exactly makes you think I don't belong here? Is it the jeans, the boots, or is it just that I don't kiss up to people like you?" Marcus's face turned a deeper shade of red, his fists clenching at his sides. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he snapped, his voice loud enough to echo through the room. "But clever doesn't pay for a $350 steak, and it doesn't make you one of us. So get up, get out, and don't waste my time." At that moment, Charles, the older businessman, set down his wine glass with a deliberate clink, the sound cutting through the tension. Very energious. "Young man," he said, his voice deep and measured, addressing Marcus, "I think you've made your point. Perhaps you should let the gentleman eat in peace." Marcus whirled around, his anger now directed at Charles. "With all due respect, sir," he said, his tone barely civil, "this is my section, and I decide who gets to eat here. If you have a problem with that, take it up with the manager." Charles raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Oh, I might just do that," he said, his voice carrying a quiet threat. But Marcus, too caught up in his own ego, ignored the warning and turned back to Keanu. "Last chance," he said, his voice low and menacing. Leave, or I'll make sure you regret ever stepping foot in here." Keanu, still seated, picked up the menu again, flipping it open as if the confrontation were nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Noted," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I think I'll stay. And while you're here, why don't you take my order? I'm ready to decide." Marcus let out an incredulous laugh, shaking his head. "Unbelievable," he muttered. "Fine. If you want to play this game, let's play." He snatched the menu from Keanu's hands, flipping it closed with a sharp snap. "But don't say I didn't warn you when the bill comes. And just so we're clear, our restaurant has a 20% minimum tipping policy. Keep that in mind, if you can even afford it." Keanu's eyes met Marcus's, a flicker of something unreadable passing through them. "I appreciate the reminder," he said, his tone now carrying a faint edge. "Now, about that order. I'll have the foie gras rossini. $350 per plate." Marcus nearly choked, his smugness faltering for the first time. "Excuse me?" he said, blinking rapidly. "You do realize that dish is $350, right? I just want to make sure there are no surprises when the bill arrives." Keanu nodded, his smile returning, but this time it carried a hint of steel. "I'm aware," he said. "$5 hours. It sounds wonderful. And while you're at it, maybe bring me a fresh napkin. I seem to have gotten a little wet." The jab landed, and Marcus's face twisted with fury. "Fat." "Fine," he spat, scribbling the order down with an unnecessary flourish. "But don't expect me to hold your hand through this. You're on your own." He turned on his heel, storming off toward the kitchen, but not before muttering loudly enough for others to hear. "He'll be out of here as soon as he sees the check. Just watch." As Marcus disappeared, Elena leaned toward Victor, her voice low but firm. "That waiter is awful," she said. "That man has been nothing but polite, and he keeps trying to humiliate him." Victor shrugged, still smirking. "If he can't handle the heat, he shouldn't be in the kitchen," he said. But his tone lacked conviction, as if he were starting to question his own stance. Charles, meanwhile, raised his wineglass in Keanu's direction, a subtle show of support. Keanu responded with a slight nod, a soft smile playing on his lips. Marcus, oblivious to the shifting tide, was already plotting his next move, determined to see Keanu humiliated. But what he didn't realize was that the night was far from over, and the man he had underestimated was about to turn the tables in ways he could never imagine. Marcus strutted away from Keanu's table, his smirk widening as he passed by a table of VIP guests, confident that he had the upper hand. He leaned in toward one of his regulars, a well-known Hollywood producer, and whispered just loud enough for surrounding guests to hear. "Some people just don't know their place, do they?" The producer chuckled, swirling the deep red wine in his glass. "You've got to admire the confidence, though," he mused, thinking he can just waltz in here and blend in. Marcus grinned, satisfied with himself. The night was going just as he expected. That man in the old boots and soaked jeans would soon regret ever stepping foot into Aurora. But what Marcus didn't realize was that the tide was about to turn, and hard. Across the dining room, the restaurant manager, a man in his mid-50s named Richard, was swiftly making his way toward Keanu's table. Richard, with his sharp suit and air of strict professionalism, had been summoned by more than one concerned guest, including Charles, the silver-haired businessman who had quietly observed the entire exchange. By the time Richard arrived, the energy in the restaurant had shifted, the air thick with anticipation. Keanu had just finished dabbing at the water on his jeans when Marcus returned with the bill, his eyes glinting with anticipation. He placed the leather checkbook in front of Keanu and tapped it twice, his voice dripping with false politeness. "I hope everything was to your liking," he said, his smirk barely contained. "And, just so we're clear, gratuity is not included. We expect a minimum of 20%, assuming you can manage that." A few nearby patrons turned their heads, their curiosity piqued. Marcus's smugness was almost tangible, and for a moment it seemed like he had won. But then Keanu nodded calmly, picked up the checkbook, and opened it. The moment he reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek jet-black card, the air in the room shifted. Marcus's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing as he caught a glimpse of the card's embossed logo, a design reserved for the ultra-wealthy, the kind of card that didn't just open doors but owned them. "Wait, is that?" ? Quote. Marcus began, but before he could finish, Richard appeared beside him, his expression tight, his posture rigid. "Mr. Reeves," Richard said, his voice carrying a mix of deference and urgency. "My sincerest apologies, sir." The words hit Marcus like a freight train, his stomach dropping, his palms growing clammy. The name echoed in his mind. "Reeves? No way!" But the confirmation came when Richard bowed slightly, his face etched with an anxious smile. "We had no idea you were dining with us tonight." Please allow me to personally handle your check. Your meal, of course, is complimentary." The entire restaurant fell silent, the clink of silverware and hum of conversation replaced by gasps and frantic whispers. Just a wait couple. Victor and Elena, the wealthy couple, exchanged stunned looks, Elena's earlier disapproval of Marcus now fully vindicated. Charles, the older businessman, nodded knowingly, a faint smile playing on his lips. Marcus, however, stood frozen, his throat tightening, his mind racing to process the impossible truth. He had been mocking, belittling, and humiliating one of the owners of Aurora. Keanu closed the checkbook calmly, then slowly looked up at Marcus, his gaze unreadable. "No need for that," he said to Richard, his voice steady. "I'd prefer to pay." He turned his attention back to Marcus, his eyes narrowing slightly, but his tone remaining calm. "But before we do that, I think we need to have a conversation." The silence in the restaurant was so thick it felt suffocating. Every guest, every waiter, even the bartender stopped what they were doing to watch. Marcus opened his mouth, but nothing came out, his once arrogant demeanor crumbling into dust. "Carriage." Keanu leaned forward, his voice still calm but carrying a quiet authority that silenced the entire room. "Tell me, Marcus," he said, pausing to let the weight of his words settle. "What made you think I didn't belong here?" Marcus swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know." "I didn't know," he stammered, his eyes darting around, seeking an escape that didn't exist. "Didn't know what?" Keanu pressed, his tone sharpening. "That I was one of the restaurant's owners? That I had money? Or that I was worthy of being here?" Marcus's face burned, the room closing in on him. I thought," he started, but Keanu cut him off, his voice firm but not cruel. "You thought you could decide who belongs based on what they wear, how they look, how they don't fit your narrow definition of class? But here's the thing, Marcus. True class isn't about a suit or a bank account. It's about respect, and tonight you showed none." The words landed like a slap, and Marcus flinched, his eyes burning with humiliation. Richard, his patience now gone, turned to Marcus, his voice stern. "Marcus, I think you owe Mr. Reeves an explanation." But before Marcus could respond, Keanu raised a hand, silencing the room again. "Actually, Richard," he said, his tone shifting to something almost playful, "I have a better idea." He stood, slipping his card back into his jacket, and faced Marcus directly, his presence suddenly commanding in a way that made Marcus shrink. "You've spent all night trying to prove I don't belong here. So let's test your theory. I've just invited a group of guests to join us, people who, by your standards, probably don't belong either. They'll be here in 10 minutes. Your job is to serve them properly, respectfully, the way every guest deserves, for 1 hour. If you can do that, you keep your job. If not, you're out." Marcus blinked, his mouth falling open. "What?" he said, his voice cracking. "You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," Keanu replied, his smile now carrying a hint of steel. "Consider it a lesson in humility, or, if you prefer, a chance to prove me wrong. The clock starts when they walk in." Richard nodded, his expression grim. "You heard Mr. Reeves," he said to Marcus. "I suggest you prepare yourself." The room buzzed with whispers, the tension palpable. Victor leaned toward Elena, his earlier smugness replaced by unease. "This is going to be interesting," he muttered. Elena, however, smiled faintly. "It's his lice. It's exactly what he deserves," she whispered back. Charles, still seated, raised his wineglass slightly, his eyes twinkling with approval. Marcus, his face pale, his hands trembling, turned to Keanu, searching for a way out but found none. "Fine," he said through gritted teeth, his voice barely audible. "I'll do it." Keanu nodded, his expression unreadable. "Good," he said. "Let's see if you can learn something tonight." As he sat back down, the restaurant braced itself for what was to come, the night now teetering on the edge of chaos and revelation. The dining room of Aurora buzzed with a nervous energy as Marcus stood stiffly near the front desk, his jaw clenched, his palms sweaty. The 10 minutes Keanu had given him felt like an eternity. But the moment the group of ordinary guests walked through the door, Marcus's stomach dropped. There were 6 of them, 3 men and 3 women, dressed in casual clothes that, to Marcus, screamed out of place. One man wore a faded flannel shirt, another a worn-out hoodie, and a woman sported a thrift store jacket that clashed violently with Aurora's pristine aesthetic. Marcus's lip curled instinctively, but he caught himself, remembering Keanu's challenge. Serve them properly, respectfully, for 1 hour, or lose his job. Keanu, now seated at a central table that Richard had hastily arranged for him, watched Marcus with a calm, unreadable expression. The rest of the restaurant watched too, the tension palpable. Victor and Elena, the wealthy couple, leaned forward in their seats. Victor still skeptical but intrigued, while Elena's disapproval of Marcus had hardened into quiet support for Keanu. Charles, the silver-haired businessman, sipped his wine, his sharp eyes missing nothing, a faint smile playing on his lips. Marcus plastered on a fake smile, his movements jerky as he approached the group. "Good evening," he said, his voice strained, the politeness forced. "Welcome to Aurora. Please follow me to your table." He led them to a table near the center of the dining room, a prime spot as Keanu had instructed, but his disdain was evident in the way he pulled out their chairs, his gestures sharp and impatient. The group, however, seemed unfazed, chatting amiably as they settled in, their laughter a stark contrast to the hushed whispers of Aurora's elite patrons. Marcus handed out menus with a tight-lipped smile, but his patience frayed almost immediately when one of the women, a middle-aged brunette in a denim jacket, asked, "What's the difference between the truffle risotto and the mushroom risotto?" Marcus couldn't help himself. "Well," he said, his tone dripping with condescension, "if you have to ask, you probably can't afford either. But the truffle is $75 more, because, truffles are a luxury ingredient." The woman blinked, taken aback, but before she could respond, one of the men, a burly guy in a flannel shirt, laughed. "Wow, friendly service," he said, his tone light but pointed. "You must really love your job." Marcus's face flushed, but he bit back a retort, remembering the stakes. "I'll give you a few minutes to decide," he muttered, turning on his heel and storming toward the kitchen, where he leaned against the wall, muttering to himself, "This is ridiculous. These people don't belong here. This is a joke." But the clock was ticking, and he had no choice but to continue. As Marcus struggled, the mood in the restaurant began to shift. Elena, watching the exchange, leaned toward Victor, her voice low but firm. "He's awful," she said. "Those people are just trying to enjoy their meal, and he's treating them like dirt." Victor, who had initially sided with Marcus, shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe," he admitted, his earlier smugness fading. "Do it. But you've got to admit, they don't exactly fit in here." Elena shook her head, her sapphire gown shimmering as she straightened. "Fit in? Since when does that matter? They're guests, just like us." "That waiter needs to learn some manners." Charles, meanwhile, observed the scene with growing interest, his earlier disapproval of Marcus now tinged with curiosity about Keanu's intentions. When Marcus returned to the table to take the group's order, his attitude hadn't improved. "So what'll it be?" he asked, his tone clipped, his pen hovering over his notepad. The man in the hoodie, a wiry guy with a scruffy beard, grinned. "I'll have the foie gras rossini, $350, he said, his voice carrying a hint of mischief. Marcus froze, his pen stopping midair. "You're joking," he said, his voice flat. The man raised an eyebrow. "Do I look like I'm joking?" he replied, his tone now carrying an edge. Marcus's facade cracked, his voice rising. "Look, let's not waste everyone's time," he said, his patience gone. "That dish is for people who actually belong here. Maybe stick to something. Something more affordable, like the salad." The table fell silent, the group exchanging looks. But before anyone could respond, a soft cough came from Keanu's table. Keanu stood, his presence suddenly commanding, and walked over, his movements deliberate. "Problem, Marcus?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a quiet authority. Marcus whirled around, his face pale. They're not serious," he stammered. "They can't possibly afford." "Afford what?" Keanu interrupted, his tone sharpening. "The same dish I ordered? The one you mocked me for? Or is it that you've decided once again who belongs here and who doesn't?" Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came out. Keanu turned to the group, his expression softening. "Your orders are on me tonight," he said, his voice warm. Order whatever you like." The man in the hoodie grinned wider, leaning back in his chair. "Thanks, Keanu," he said, his tone now carrying a weight that made Marcus blink. "I think I'll stick with the foie gras rossini. Oh, and by the way, you might want to tell your waiter here to be careful who he insults. I'm Jonathan Pryce, restaurant critic for Gourmet Insider." The revelation hit Marcus like a punch to the gut, his face draining of color. The room buzzed with gasps and whispers. The name instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with the culinary world. Jonathan Pryce was notorious for his scathing reviews, capable of making or breaking a restaurant with a single article. Marcus's hands trembled, his notepad slipping from his fingers as the reality of his mistake sank in. The hour passed in a blur of mistakes. Marcus misdelivered orders, snapped at the group when they asked for refills, and even accidentally spilled a glass of wine on the woman in the denim jacket, his frustration boiling over. When the clock finally struck the end of the hour, Marcus stood before Keanu, his head bowed, his arrogance shattered. "You failed," Keanu said, his voice firm but not cruel. "You let your biases dictate your actions, and you disrespected people who deserved better." Marcus braced himself, expecting the worst, but Keanu's next words caught him off guard. "I'm not going to fire you," Keanu said, pausing to let the words sink in. "Instead, I'm giving you a chance to learn. Starting tomorrow, you'll work at a charity restaurant I run downtown, serving people who, by your standards, don't belong. You'll do it for a month. If you can prove you've changed, you can come back here. If not—" Marcus nodded stiffly, his throat tight, unable to meet Keanu's gaze. The room was silent, the lesson clear. Elena smiled softly, her earlier frustration replaced by admiration, while Victor, now humbled, nodded in agreement. Charles raised his wineglass, his approval evident. As the group of ordinary guests left, Jonathan Pryce paused at Keanu's table, his grin wide. "Nice move, Keanu," he said. "And don't worry, my review will be glowing. But that waiter, he's got a lot to learn." Keanu nodded, his expression unreadable, but his eyes carried a quiet satisfaction. The night had been a lesson, not just for Marcus but for everyone watching. As the heavy doors of Aurora swung shut behind Keanu Reeves, the restaurant exhaled, the tension of the night dissipating, like the final notes of a fading symphony. Keanu stepped into the warm Beverly Hills night, his faded jacket blending into the shadows, his departure as unassuming as his arrival. For him, this wasn't about revenge or humiliation. It was about planting a seed, a lesson in respect that would linger long after he was gone. Inside, conversations resumed in hushed tones, stolen glances flickering toward Marcus, who stood stiffly near the kitchen, his face a mask of resentment and confusion. Marcus's initial reaction was anger, his pride bruised, his ego battered. He muttered under his breath, "This is ridiculous. A charity restaurant? He's just trying to humiliate me." But as the night wore on, the weight of Keanu's words began to sink in. Marcus thought of the group of ordinary guests, of Jonathan Pryce's scathing grin, and of his own smugness now exposed as arrogance. For the first time he wondered if he had been wrong, not just tonight, but in every moment he had judged someone based on their appearance. At the bar, Victor and Elena clinked their glasses, their voices low. "I hope he learns something," Elena said, her earlier frustration replaced by a quiet hope. "If he's smart, he will," Victor replied, taking a measured sip of his drink. But the night's final surprise came from Charles, the silver-haired businessman who had silently supported Keanu all evening. He finished his wine, set the glass down with a thoughtful nod, and approached Richard, the manager, who was still reeling from the night's events. "Richard," Charles said, his voice deep and measured, "I'd like to speak with Mr. Reeves about that charity restaurant. I want to fund it fully." Richard blinked, stunned. "Sir, that's incredibly generous, but why?" Charles smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting a story untold. "Because I was once like those people Marcus mocked," he said, "a nobody in worn-out clothes dismissed by people like him. But someone gave me a chance, and now I give back. Tell Marcus that when he starts his month there, I'll be watching." Richard nodded, speechless, as Charles left, his revelation a quiet thunderclap in the night's aftermath. The restaurant closed, but the lesson remained etched into the minds of all who witnessed it. Marcus, still grappling with his pride, faced a choice: learn or lose everything. And as Keanu disappeared into the city lights, One final thought echoed. In a world full of prejudice, kindness is the only choice. Keanu's story teaches us that true worth lies not in appearances, but in actions. Like Marcus, we all risk letting biases blind us, judging others by their clothes or status. But respect and kindness are choices we can make every day, transforming strangers into allies and mistakes into growth. Apply this in life. Treat everyone with dignity, no matter who they seem to be. If you liked this video, leave a like, subscribe, and help us bring you more exciting stories involving celebrities. Here you will be updated every day on the world of celebrities. See you soon.